Scientist, inventor, activist, autism spokesperson, and one in the top 10 college professors in the United States, named by CEOWORLD magazine. This and much, much more is Dr. Temple Grandin. No more words needed, I believe. Thank you very much, Mrs. Grandin, that you accepted the invitation for today's interview for the Czech National Institute for Autism, and welcome.
It's thank you for really wonderful to be here. Thank you.
So during your performances, your speech is mainly encouraging. You often mention what autism brought to you, in which way it has been helping you, and you also speak about children on the spectrum, how to motivate them and encourage them in activities they are good at. So my first question will be probably a little bit unconventional, let's say. In which way is autism bothering you? Is there any autistic side of you that you would rather change or remove?
Well, I have problems with multitasking. Basically, if I was a computer, if you know your computer history, I'd be an Intel 286. That'd be one of the early desktops, small processor, but huge memory. And in my work designing, I can use my huge memory. And doing design work, also somebody who's mathematically inclined, doing computer programming, that does not, you don't need a big processor. That works off of working memory, but I have problems with multitasking. I still have that problem. But we need to be working on developing the person's strengths. My strengths in drawing showed up really early, and that helped me in my design work. I'm going to show you some of my drawings right there that I've done. I hope those are clear. In cattle handling systems.
Is that one that it was in the film, in the movie about you? Is it?
Yes, some of my actual drawings were in that movie. One thing I really liked in the HBO movie is it showed how my visual thinking worked. It showed that perfectly. It also had my projects, and I did all of those projects that were shown in the movie. And I've worked with a lot of some very skilled craftspeople on building some of my projects, and people that had multiple patents. People my age, now I'm in my 70s, that probably were autistic. And they were very good at designing machinery and building it.
I asked you what side of your autism you dislike the most, but on the contrary, what do you like most about your autism? Is it the visual thinking that you mentioned, or is it something else?
Well, I think very logically, very logical in how I think. And I like my visual thinking. And it makes me really good at certain types of problem solving. You know, how do you figure out how to build something? Or just, how do you figure out, to do a lot of different things? Now, I want to talk about the different kinds of specialized thinking that people with autism can have. I think in pictures, and I describe that in my book on thinking in pictures. I describe that. But there's other individuals with autism that think in patterns. They are the mathematical thinkers. See, it's different kinds of thinkers. I think in pictures. There's others that think in patterns and mathematics. And they're going to be very good at computer programming, engineering. And then a third type is a word thinker. And these people are very good at facts. They like history. They like sports statistics. And one of the things that these kind of people can be very good at is specialized sales in maybe a car dealership, because they know every car on, any kind of a specialized product. Another person on the spectrum, he sells business insurance. Again, a specialized product, and he knows all about it. But the skills will be uneven. My kind of thinking, I can't do algebra. And you need to go right straight to geometry and trigonometry. Skip algebra. The mathematical thinkers may have trouble with reading. Now, in my own case, I did not talk until age 4. I had very good early education. I did have trouble with reading, and mother taught me with phonics, sounding out my words. Now, another child may work better with the sight words, just memorizing sight words. Use the method that works.
You mentioned your childhood. I would like to mention that you were growing up in times when autism was interpreted as the result of missing social bond between mother and her child. The view of science and experts about autism has changed a lot since those days, and it has been still changing. So what is, according to you, the biggest, most fundamental transformation?
Well, you gradually learn. First of all, I'm 73. So when I was a young child up to age 10, blaming mothers had not started yet. My mother was not subjected to that. I was very lucky because I'm 73. If I'd been 63, then I would have been subjected to that. That is completely wrong. Autism's genetic, pretty much. It's inherited. And you go out to our tech areas or computer science companies, and there's a lot of programmers there that have autism. There's also a lot of families there that have autistic kids. I was very lucky that mother got me into a very good speech therapy program very early. And in my generation, the children were taught social skills. I had good teachers. I also had lots of time for free play just to explore and do things. I'd just get out, my sister and I had rock collections. We'd collect shells on the beach and make things out of them. I'd observe birds. I mean, these are things that a lot of kids today are not doing. In fact, I have a new book that just came out called The Outdoor Scientist, and it covers a lot of the things that I used to do as a child, because I've worked with many other professionals that were probably autistic kids. See, autism goes from socially awkward with no speech delay, where I had severe speech delay. Then you have some individuals that never learned to talk. They're much more severe. It's a very, very big spectrum. But we got to get kids out doing things. I spent hours and hours playing with little bird kites. This is another book on this on my childhood projects. I would make parachutes and little kites. I'd spend hours doing this, hours building things. Today, children are not doing enough stuff with their hands. They're not using tools, making things, sewing things, doing art. I had lots of these activities as a child, and they were very important in my education.
But in terms of science, what change is, according to you, the biggest one in understanding to autism?
Yeah, well, it's a brain difference. Brain scan data is very clear on that. In fact, I've got a lot of the science in another one of my books, The Autistic Brain, and it is a brain difference. And it's also a continuous trait. A person can be more thinking and into what they do, or a person can be more emotional, social. Well, you lose a bit of the emotional, social, and you get more circuits for stuff like engineering, computer science, maybe art or music. I think it's really important to develop the child's strengths. When I was 8 years old, my ability in art and drawing showed up. And I was just making pictures of the same horse head over and over again. My mother encouraged me to draw lots of different things and to use different media, not use other things to draw with besides pencil. Take that interest and broaden it. An autistic kid likes cars. Let's learn how to fix them. Let's learn how they work. You can do mathematics with cars. You can read about cars. Take that interest and broaden it. It can turn into a career.
If we if we will continue in talking about the changes and transformation with respect to the autism, but let's focus more on the, let's say, ordinary public. How has changed awareness of autism in a neurotypical society in the past decades?
One thing I learned when I started in my work in the livestock industry, being a woman was a much bigger barrier than autism. I had to make myself very good at what I did. Became very good at designing equipment. I have major pieces of equipment that are in major companies. I've done design work for all of our major livestock companies in the U.S. And so the way I sold my skills is I would show my work, and I just showed you those drawings. And when I did an interview, I would take the drawings and lay them out on the table, or maybe somebody's good at programming. Then they'd show some of the code that they did, or an app that they made from a phone. I learned to sell my work rather than myself and be good at what I did. Because in the field of science, there's a lot of people that have mild autism that are undiagnosed. Same thing is true for the tech industry. Lots of people that are, mildly autistic work in the tech industry. And that's the reason why we have technologies like what we're using today.
Actually, that was one of my next questions. Is there a difference if you are a woman on spectrum and if you are a man on spectrum today?
Well, oftentimes the women fail to get diagnosed. They tend to be better at, acting more normal. And one of the big problems of some of the autistic women is getting into abusive marriages. That's, they're so eager to have a relationship. Now, I have another book called Different Not Less, and it's about 18 people that told their stories, and they were diagnosed later in life. These were individuals that had good jobs, but their relationships were real problems. And when they learned that they were autistic, that helped them to understand their relationships. That gave them insight. Now, I'm seeing too many individuals with an autism label being held back, getting too overprotected, not doing enough things. I'm seeing too many kids today with the label are not learning basic skills like shopping. This was a skill I learned when I was 8 and 9 years old.
It's also said that women on spectrum are better at camouflage in masking of autism. So have you been ever masking your autism by yourself?
Well, you see, there's been a lot of discussion about that. I mean, I'm not the hyper-social. I know how to do business social. How do you go in, talk to client, work social, I know how to do. Go out and do the party bar scene, I don't go there. It's too noisy, and some of the, if you got to go and do that scene. The other problem I have is on the multitasking, rapidly moving social conversations go by so quickly I cannot hear them. So just social for the sake of social I don't do, but I love to talk about shared interests. And when I have friends, we're both interested in horses, or we're both interested in how to build something. Friends through shared interests. One teacher had an autistic kid in her class, and he liked Star Wars. So she started a Star Wars club, and that enabled this child to have friends who shared interests. But just social for the sake of social, I see people at parties having such a great time. I cannot hear the conversations over all the racket, and so it's not very fun for me. Also, I don't process information quickly enough that you can follow some of the conversations.
We were talking about changes in awareness of autism in neurotypical society. So are there still any big lacks, according to you, in awareness? And what should we focus on in next year?
Well, all right, let's talk about things that employers can do. I have very little working memory. And so if I have to do a task that involves a sequence, like take apart an ice cream machine and clean it, for example, I need to write down the steps, similar to a pilot's checklist. Write down the steps of how to take it apart, clean it, put it back together again. Because I cannot remember a long verbal description. I need to write it down. Jobs with a lot of multitasking I may have problems with. Where I might be really good working in a store, an office supply store, for example, might be fine there. But a super busy restaurant, might be too much multitasking.
You mentioned employees. Do you think that company, because I don't know the situation in America properly, but do you think that companies in the United States know a lot of information about autism, about people on spectrum, and how to behave to them, for example, during job interviews?
Well, when I did an interview, I simply laid out the drawings and the photographs of jobs, and I showed off the work. I think we also need to realize a lot of jobs, you go in the back door. Half of all good jobs for everybody are back door. And what does that mean? That means you had a friend that worked for that company. You knew somebody that owned a little shop that the individual could work in. That's half of all good jobs. And just about everything I got into was backdoor. There's a scene in the movie, in the HBO movie, where I go up to the editor of the farm magazine and I get his card. Because I knew if I wrote for that magazine, that could really help my career. That's an example of a backdoor. And I grabbed that opportunity, and then I wrote an article that summarized my master's thesis on cattle handling.
In the Czech Republic, for example, during job interviews, companies are not prepared for people on spectrum. They don't know how to act with them. Is it similar in the United States?
The problem is that people that conduct interviews, it's very social. But let's say you're hiring somebody for a computer programming job. That's not a social job. It would be better to be interviewed by somebody that programs, and then you could show your portfolio of your programming, and if somebody in programming would look at that and, well, that's really beautiful code, I'm going to hire you. You see, when I got hired to design things, a lot of my work was before there was internet. We had to use the telephone and the old-fashioned, letter mail. And I sent the head of one of our major beef companies a portfolio that had a big drawing in it, it had pictures in it, and I sent that to the head of the company, and he looked at the drawing, and he looked at the pictures, and he hired me. I recommend make a portfolio that you can show artwork. I looked at a portfolio a 10-year-old boy had made of photography. I go, this is professional. This child right now could go into commercial photography. They held up some of his photos just held it up to the computer camera. It was obvious that this child had talent in photography. Well, you can make a career out of photography. So your interview is showing off the photos.
I would like to move to another topic. You are an author of a couple of books about autism. You've shown some of them today. You also speak to parents, teachers, professionals during your performances. But I would like to ask you if you also share your experiences with the children's audience. Because I'm asking because a lot of children on the spectrum are victims of bullying from their peers. You also experience it. And children with autism often miss friends and understanding. So is it, according to you, something that maybe we neglect as a society, that we neglect to spread awareness about autism and also other disabilities among children and young people, and to teach them from a very, very young age about understanding and tolerance for those who are different in some ways?
Well, we need to control bullying. When I was a teenager, I was called all kinds of names. It was terrible. It was the worst part of my life. Only places I was not bullied was activities I did with friends who shared interests. Horseback riding, building electronic devices. Those were two things I did in high school. I could do with other students. And the students who were the bullies were not interested in riding horses or building electronics. Also, we did some skiing, and I was not bullied there. Again, that's friends who shared interests. That's really important. Now, when I was in elementary school or primary school, I managed to avoid being bullied because my teacher explained to the other students in my third grade, this would be when I was 8 years old, that I had a disability, but it was not visible, like a wheelchair would be visible. And they needed to be helping me, not bullying me. And that worked really well because I know that there's many kids in primary school that are getting bullied. And I managed to, I had a good experience in primary school. High school was absolutely horrible.
People with autism are in recent years louder and louder. Self-advocacy is developing. People are not ashamed to talk about their diagnosis and all consequences openly and publicly. They are not afraid to fight for their rights. However, you said in one interview that you are concerned about the fact that self-advocacy is the main priority for some young people on the spectrum, and that they fix on that too much. Why is it wrong?
You see, what's interesting is I go out to one of our big tech companies. I've been to all of them, all the big name tech companies that make the tech, like the technology we're using right now. I've been to this company. And a lot of these programmers that they know they're autistic, but they avoid the label. And I think they don't want to define them because they're a computer programmer first. And for me, a scientist comes first. Now, autism is an important part of who I am, and I would not want to change, but being a scientist comes first. You see, what I'm seeing on the fully verbal end of the scale is I'm seeing situations where labels are holding people back on the careers and the jobs. Now, where the labels are an advantage for someone later in life is understanding why their relationships have problems. It gives them insight. And I talked to somebody, a lady just the other day, probably in her early 40s, and she said that getting a diagnosis was like a relief, because now she understands why she's had problems, with marriages or something like that. On the professional side, I'm seeing too many teenagers being overprotected, and they're not learning shopping, they're not getting jobs, they're not learning to drive. That's going to take longer because we're multitasking. More practice is going to be required in a totally safe place away from traffic, such as stadium, parking lots, and back roads.
So you think they use autism diagnosis such as excuse for some behavior, for example?
Well, what I'm seeing is parents tend to overprotect. I remember talking to a mother, and her teenage boy with autism was doing really well in school, but he had never gone in a store and bought anything. And I suggested that he go in and buy some paper for the printer. And the mom said she was not able to let go. I see some parents get way too overprotective when the child should be learning just some very basic skills, like buying things in stores. And when I was a young child, I got a little bit of money, and there were certain items my mother never bought for me. That came from my allowance, this little small amount of money. If I wanted to buy a comic book or a candy bar or a little toy airplane, those came out of this pocket change, this allowance. And if I wanted to get a slightly more expensive airplane, I had to save for 2 weeks. I was learning this as a very young child, idea of saving money. Because little kites and airplanes, toy airplanes, mother didn't buy those. We call those allowance items. And a lot of kids are not learning these things. Also, social skills have to be taught. I explained to parents, it's like teaching somebody how to behave in a foreign country. You know, this is how we say please and thank you in another country. And I think that's another reason why the grandfather, who was mildly autistic, had a good career. And I'm seeing many grandfathers come up to me, and they discover they have autism when the children get diagnosed. But that grandfather had a good job, because when he was 11, he was delivering newspapers or doing some other job. He'd learned working skills really early. And I'm not seeing enough training on life skills and working skills. The other problem we have is autism is such a big spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you have somebody, top programmer for a technology company. At the other end of the spectrum, you have somebody that cannot talk and cannot dress themselves. You got the same label. That does not make very much sense. You see, as a visual thinker, I don't get locked into this because they're very different. But if you're a verbal thinker, there's a tendency to just put them all together.
But I think maybe it's important to find the difference between what our child is able to do and what is not able to do, maybe.
Well, sometimes parents underestimate what their child is able to do. Now during all these COVID lockdowns, one of the things I learned that really helped me is getting on a schedule. Get up in the morning, dressed for work every day. That really helps. I was grounded for a year. I did not fly for an entire year. I now have gone on some trips. And I went on a trip just really recently to Texas. And I went and visited a camp they had there where they have a family come in for maybe 3 or 4 days. And they stay in a cabin. No internet, no TV, no electronics. And maybe the child rides a horse for the first time or picks some vegetables in the garden. And they find they can do these things. And one of the most important things that camp does, and it's only a 3 or 4 day visit, is to show the mom and dad things their kid's capable of, that their child's capable of, that they're amazed that they got the kid to ride a horse. And there was another program where they got them on boats. And the mom would say, my kid went on a boat, and this might have been a nonverbal child. He went on a boat and he liked it. And you just introduce it gradually. And I talked to the lady that ran one of the camps, and she said one of the most important things that the children learn, what the parents learn, is maybe their child's capable of more than what they think they're capable of.
I would like to go back for a while to self-advocacy groups, because in the Czech Republic, some self-advocates have quite extreme opinions. For example, that nobody on the autism spectrum has intellect disorders, and therefore people with autism should always decide about themselves. They should not be pushed, for example, by parents or assistants into therapies to push learning new skills or adapting to major society. Another opinion from this extreme self-advocacy group is that only other people on the spectrum are able to provide professional care and help to people with autism. What is your attitude to these kinds of opinions, to these, let's say, extreme self-advocacy groups?
Well, that's being extreme. But some of the most fun stuff I did in my life, I worked on very large construction projects for major companies. And we sometimes had to figure out how to build something. And I'd sit down with the other people and we'd figure it out. And it was stressful, but it also was very rewarding. And if I had a choice, what would I rather do? Play video games all day? Because that's happening to quite a few people where they're not pushed at all, or have done the things that I have done. I would have rather have done the things that I have done. Now, there's been controversies about different therapies, ABA, there's been controversies. Some of the advocates were subjected to some very bad ABA, where they were forced into sensory overload. That is not acceptable. And the ABA did not recognize sensory problems. Sensory problems are real. I had problems with touch sensitivity, sound sensitivity. Another person may have visual problems where certain kinds of lights are going to be flashing on and off and making it really bad. That's something that may need to be accommodated. But what was done with me is what I call stretching, just a little bit outside the comfort zone. Not putting me into a super noisy train station where I would be complete sensory overload. Always giving me choices. And if you don't stretch, they don't develop. I've talked to a number of parents where they got a really good job for their child. And they'll say they blossom, so like a flower just blooming as they experience new things. Now, you've got to do things right. And I had some very good mentors. I had an excellent speech teacher, excellent primary school teacher, a really good science teacher who gave me interesting projects to do. Some of those, the optical illusion room was shown in the movie. And he showed me how education is a pathway to a goal. Because if you don't stretch a little bit, they don't develop. But some of those advocates had some very bad therapy. And they are correct on hating it. Forcing people into sensory overload is absolutely not acceptable. But on the other hand, there's some things you need to conform. There's a scene in that movie where they slammed down some deodorant. My boss did and said, "You stink, use it." That happened. And one of the things is hygiene. Even on the construction site, you've got to take a shower and you've got to put a clean shirt on. This is something that's just so obnoxious, nasty for other people. Hygiene is non-negotiable. That you've got to clean it up. Eccentric, fine. You want to be eccentric, that's fine. And also, just a little bit of social politeness. I went to a conference a number of years ago, and an advocate, I think one of the extreme ones, came up to me. I had never met him before, and he says, "Who the swear word are you?" I'm not going to repeat the swear word. That was how he greeted me. That's not acceptable. It's not masking to do a little bit of just what I call business social, etiquette social. You know, there's some things where you have to conform a little bit, especially on things like that, and that's not hard. Now, you're not going to turn me into the party bar scene. That would be masking. I don't do parties and bars. I like to eat out with a quiet place. I have a good friend. These two computer programmers got married. Oh, let me tell you their idea of romantic dinner. Yes, fine restaurant, fine food, wine, candles, because it's going to be really romantic, so we can have a 4-hour discussion on computer data storage systems, because they are the most interesting thing in the world. I can relate to that. Okay, but when they're at that restaurant, they can't be screaming and yelling and swearing and bothering the other diners. And they pick a restaurant that's quiet. Well, there's some things, and there's some nonverbal people who can learn to type independently. And they actually have a good brain inside. And there's some good books on that. People that type completely independently. And one of my favorites is by Tito Mukapadahe, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? And he types completely independently, and he describes problems with he can't control his movements and problems with his seeing, and the visual system doesn't work. The eye is fine, but see back here in the back of the brain, the circuits that assemble the graphics files, and they're not working right, and the image is all breaking up. Describes that. And so he's living in a sensory, jumbled up world. He also discusses extreme effort is required to screen out background noise. Like I'd ask him a question, he could type it really fast on his little computer, but then he had to rest. And some people on the spectrum are going to need sensory breaks. That's something that's going to need to be accommodated. They're going to need a quiet place to work, away from all the noise. That's something that some individuals are going to need, or a different kind of lighting. That's something that they're going to need.
My another question is, there are also a lot of myths and biases about autism in society. What myth do you dislike most?
One of the myths is that everybody's like the old movie Rain Man. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie. And he was what's called a savant. And I am not a savant. Extreme skills in mathematics. Not everybody's like that. And then you also have half the spectrum that remains either nonverbal or partially verbal. And I do not like the term low functioning and high functioning. Now that's in some of my publications, especially older ones. I'm trying to work on phasing that out. Because some of the nonverbals, when you read some of the books written by them, the ones that type independently, they've got a good mind in there, in a body that they can't not control, and seeing and vision that's all scrambled up. But the myth is that they're all the same. Yeah, that they're not all the Rain Man type. That's a relatively small percentage.
You have been fascinated by science and inventions from a very young age. You are also an author of many inventions and new systems of more human and efficient treatments of cattle. You also invented, let's say, your squeeze machine, which really helped you. But have you been ever wondering about inventing some invention for people on spectrum?
Well, I was a very anxious and deep pressure calmed me. Now that works for some people with autism, not for everybody. And I could also control the squeeze machine. Sometimes you can learn to tolerate a stimuli if you control it. There's been some successes with children with loud noise, where if they are allowed to control the hairdryer, control the vacuum cleaner, ring a bell where they press the button, where they control it, that sometimes helps to desensitize it, where they control the turning on of the thing that is loud, because the sensory issues are different. One of my top areas for research would be the sensory problems. Everybody, the normal people are all hung up on the social problems, but it's impossible to be social if the places that are social are noisy. See, one of the problems is a lot of social places are very noisy. And I'm not deaf, but if I'm in a noisy environment, I can't hear. So in a noisy restaurant, it's boring for me to not be able to hear the conversation. So then I start looking at the TVs or whatever that might be there in the restaurant. But working on ways to desensitize sensory. There is a paper out, the study that was done, it was called Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism. Environmental enrichment is an effective treatment for autism. Now, if you search for that paper in English, using those exact words, you can find it. And this is a method that was used in children up to about age 10 or 12, where they would stimulate two senses at the same time, like maybe smell cinnamon and touch a cold water glass.
So have you ever had an idea of inventing something for people on spectrum to help them, for example, with hypersensitivity?
Well, a squeezing machine enabled me to get desensitized to where I could tolerate hugging people. But you see, I controlled the squeeze machine. See, this gets back to the control. Okay, that's helpful, but that doesn't work for everybody. It only works for the individual who's a pressure seeker. Now, some people like their clothes loose. Other people like tight clothes, like those outfits that bicycle athletes wear. For some kid, maybe wearing that under their clothes would be calming. I think I'd hate it. This is where different people are different. Another thing I want to tell parents, if you have a child who's not talking, it's 2 years old, older than 2 years old, and not talking, the worst thing you can do is just do nothing with them. No, you need to start working with them. Maybe the child's spinning a coin, turn it into a little game where they take turns spinning the coin. You know, learning how to take turns is one of the first skills you want to teach. That was done with me. And these little kids need a lot of hours of one-to-one with an effective teacher. I don't care what the name of the therapy is.
By the way, do you still use your squeeze machine or you don't need it anymore?
Well, I haven't been using it. Another thing that helped me is I take antidepressant medication. I've been on it for 40 years, and I describe it in my book, Thinking in Pictures. And I strongly recommend reading a chapter about that. And I'd rather have you read it. And if you want to translate that into your language, go right ahead and do that. I got a horrible anxiety all through my 20s. I had very bad health problems that were brought on by the stress. And I went on a low dose of an antidepressant, only a starter dose, and it greatly reduced the anxiety. I've been on it for 40 years. Now, I resisted taking the medication. And I had discovered it, in things I had read in the scientific literature. But it really helped me. And I know some other individuals on the spectrum are taking a very low dose of Prozac or fluoxetine, which is the chemical name. Prozac's the brand name. Taking a very low dose. The mistake that's made with a drug like Prozac is too high a dose. And then you're going to get agitation and you will not be able to sleep. There's way too many medications given to children. I'm against that. I was a young adult when I went on a medication. I was not a child. Way too many medications just given to children to just tranquilize them and make them sleepy. No, that is bad.
Autism, such as a lot of other disorders, is surrounded by many disinformations or alternative opinions, such as some alternative therapies, or for example, some supplements promising the healing of autism, or at least limiting its expressions. What is your attitude to these topics? Do you stick only with information that are evidence-based, or are you open even to some alternative methods or information that are not fully verified by science?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that's just wrong. There is evidence that gastrointestinal problems are increased with autism. That's evidence-based. There are some individuals where they try a special diet. It's been helpful because it will clear up the digestive problems. One of the problems with studying some of these diets, like taking out wheat, for example, removing milk and dairy products, is they do not work for everybody. I think there is a subgroup of people with autism where you do these diets. They are helpful. They do not cure autism. Absolutely do not. But they will help clear up a lot of problems with digestion, and that can reduce pain and discomfort. And there are some people where they are helpful. But there's a lot of people out there selling a lot of expensive stuff. And if you want to go dairy-free or wheat-free, that can be done with regular food. In the U.S., Mexican food's very popular. We have a thing called a corn tortilla. It's easy to do Mexican food in the U.S. on a special diet. It's really easy, and you don't have to buy anything special. Some of the things are worth trying, but there's a lot of people selling a lot of very expensive stuff, a lot of very expensive therapies. The most important thing for young children is 20 hours a week of one-to-one teaching with an effective teacher. I don't care what the name of the therapy is. It's more language, more turn-taking, more skills, and we can do a little bit of eye contact, but that's been way too overemphasized.
It's also one of your main topic that you speak to parents or to teachers, how to motivate children, how to encourage them. But maybe sometimes even people with autism, if they are older, they probably don't know what are they good at or what they could or want to do in their lives. So what advice would you give them, how they could discover their strong sides?
You have to try things. I came from a non-agricultural background, so how did I get involved in the cattle industry? I was exposed to it when I went to my aunt's ranch when I was 15. I was afraid to go. Mother gave me a choice. I had to get on a plane and fly out there. Anne was going to be on the plane with me. And I could stay for a week and come home, or I could stay all summer. Not going wasn't one of the choices. But if I really hated it, she said I could come back in a week. I got out there and I loved it. And that's how I got into the cattle industry. So you've got to get exposed to some things to find out what you might like. So if let's say I had a 20-year-old that doesn't know what he might like, I'd go, okay, what subjects were you good in school? Art, math, music, anything you were good at in school. I want to kind of figure out is going to be the visual thinking mind, the math mind, word mind, and sometimes you can get some combinations. And then Mother always gave me choices. Always gave me choices. So you could try a job in this store or that store. And you work it out with a back door. Forget the interviews. You talk to your friends that know some of the shopkeepers and then, because there's been individuals that got out and they got a job in a shop. And over again, I've had parents that he just blossomed. Just getting out and doing new things. And then we have a lot of problems with the video game addicts. And the research, you want evidence-based? Research is very clear on this. The evidence-based on this is that people on the spectrum tend to get addicted to video games. And I'm thinking about myself. Especially when I had all that anxiety, that could have happened to me. What little video game playing I've done, I remember one time playing a video game, I thought I'd done it 20 minutes, I'd done it for 4 hours. So I don't have any of that stuff on my phone or on my computer. But then you got to replace video games with something else, and there's been some individuals where they were mechanically inclined. So they said, okay, let's do an hour a day, and we're going to fix motorbikes or fix cars. And you know what? 3 people, young adults on the spectrum that were stuck playing video games, discovered fixing cars was a lot more interesting than video games. But you do it slowly. Okay, we're going to just go to the shop for an hour. You slowly replace the video games with something else. That's what you need to do. And I can relate to having all that anxiety. And I sometimes wonder what would have happened to me if I hadn't discovered the medication. Yeah, it's right here in this book. The chapter's called A Believer in Biochemistry. My health was falling apart before I went on that. Very low dose. Been on it for 40 years. And I was in my early 30s when I started on it. And that anxiety worsened. And I'd already accomplished quite a bit in the cattle industry by that time. I had done those projects that were shown in the movie. They'd been done. I was just getting ready to start working on my PhD. And then I had a very stressful eye surgery that had to be done, and I was conscious, and I'm watching needles and knives coming down at my eye. I had a little skin cancer on my eyelid, and they had to do plastic surgery while I was awake. It was not fun. And I got really stressed out over that. And that was when I took out the scientific papers I had found about the medication. I was a trained scientist at that time. And looked at the papers on anxiety, read the list of symptoms, the medications that were tried. And I tried an old one. It was called imipramine. And I'm now taking disipramine, which is very similar. Please, if you want to try this, please read it in the book. I do not want to get a mistranslation on the name of a drug. Please read it in the book, even if someone has to read it in English. You cannot have a mistake on that. It has to be right.
By the way, you often speak about your work, about your job. But what are your hobbies? What do you do in your free time?
Well, I probably need to go out and see the Godzilla and King Kong movie, just for fun. I like to do in my free time. Some of the funnest stuff I ever do is sit around and talk about how to build stuff. That's always fun.
For example,
ever since I was a very young child, when I was a little kid, if you could make it out of cardboard, I made it when I was a young child.
Which kind of stuffs do you build, for example?
I remember making puppet stages. I remember one time when I was maybe 8 years old, I had a friend over, and we built a gas station or a petrol station for toy cars out of a shoebox. And in the 50s, gas stations had flags all strung up on them. So, of course, we decorated it with flags, our toy gas station. Now, I remember doing that project.
It sounds like fun. But Mrs. Grandin, are you also contacted by people with autism, with requests for advice, for example?
Yes. In fact, I was just interviewed this morning by a young man with autism on a Spanish TV station, Tony Hernandez, and he's the one who was very proud that he managed to accomplish being able to do a cashier job, which is one of the harder jobs for somebody on the spectrum. He's very proud of that. And it's usually a job I don't recommend. I'd rather start with something that's a little easier with less multitasking. And I talk to people that are on the spectrum all the time. And I've had people write to me that I inspired them. I had, my mind tends to think in specific examples. I've had parents come to me or they write me an email and they'll say, oh, my son, I got a job, he's bought a house, he's doing great. Thanks for all your books and your talks. But again, autism has a lot of different forms, and for some individuals, very high anxiety is a serious problem.
What are the most frequent questions from people with autism that you get?
Sometimes they just ask about how you learn social skills. I had some good mentors. I can remember on a very early job I had, I criticized some welding in a very not nice way. I said that welding looked like a pigeon, a poo-poo dude on it. And the plant engineer took me aside and he explained that I needed to be more diplomatic. He told me what I should do. He didn't yell at me. He told me in private, I need to apologize to the welder for using such rude talk, and I did. He told me what I should do. The welding was not very good, but it should not have been criticized with that kind of language. I had to learn, and fortunately I had some good people in the workplace that taught me. I've talked to people on the spectrum all the time. But the other thing is I've been many years in the construction industry. Construction industry is all about finishing projects. You finish a project, you build it, you make the thing work. And I want to see the person on the spectrum get out and have a life that they like. Get into something that they like.
Mrs. Grandin, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your experiences, opinions, and other informations with us and with me. Thank you for being a guest of this interview. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it was absolutely great talking to you, and thank you so much. And I'll probably leave the meeting now, and time to say goodbye, and thank you.